Hello, ecology students. It's Dr. Welch, and in the second unit of the course, we're going to be studying ecosystem dynamics from both the perspective of energy transfer, matter cycling, and how ecosystems change over time. So let's first get started with a good understanding of what an ecosystem is. It is an energy processing system. You can think of it much like the engine of an automobile. It has inputs, it has internal components, as well as outputs. So this picture here, or a simple diagram to help you wrap your mind around what an ecosystem is. Inside of the box, the dotted lines forming the box there are the internal components. And as you notice, those are basically it's a trophic pyramid, it's a food chain. On the outside of the box, you have your inputs and your outputs. And this is the section of the course where we're going to be taking the reactions of photosynthesis and cellular respiration and scaling their impacts all the way up to the ecosystem level. So, we're taking a process that you've studied most in your past on a subcellular or organelle level. And we're not only going to scale it up to the organismal level, thinking about the growth of plants with photosynthesis, but we're going to take it all the way up to the complete addition of what's called biomass, the amount of stuff in an ecosystem, the total body weight, if you will, of all the plants, all the animals, all the microbes, you name it. We're going to scale that all the way up to biomass on an ecosystem level, as well as look at where energy, how cellular respiration plays a role not only in matter cycling, but energy transformations within the ecosystem as well. So our inputs and outputs to an ecosystem, keep in mind then they are tied to these reactions, and it helps you remember it. So our inputs for photosynthesis, we have to have solar energy, carbon dioxide, and water. There they are on the left-hand side of the figure. And on the right-hand side of the figure are products of photosynthesis. Of course, oxygen is released to the atmosphere, and the glucose or the sugars that you're used to seeing as a product of photosynthesis, those are what's being moved around between the internal components of the ecosystem. And we're going to study more of that when we look at matter cycling within the next lecture. In terms of cellular respiration, again, that food cycling within the ecosystem, there is our glucose as well as other food components that are going to be oxidized. So here's our oxygen input for our reactants of cellular respiration. And as these food molecules are oxidized, we get the release of carbon dioxide and water. Notice along each one of these transformations, we're seeing some of that solar energy being released as heat. And as you remember from chemistry, these are all exothermic reactions. Actually, photosynthesis is indeed endothermic, but there are exothermic steps that can result in some loss of heat during those chemical reactions or some loss of energy as heat. But cellular respiration is completely exothermic. So we're going to see how ecosystems, you have a reduction in the amount of energy available at each trophic level, and it's because of the exothermic nature of these reactions of primarily cellular respiration. So again, this is a section of ecology where a lot of the information you've learned in other biology courses as well as chemistry courses and a little bit of physics all comes in together to be able to explain how this system, our ecosystem, functions. So two simple places to start from what I just described, and you're going to study everything I just described in the chapter reading, is that matter flows through ecosystems. It comes into solar energy and it leaves the biological system as heat. Matter cycles within ecosystems, and that's going to be our topic of the next lecture. Carbon does not leave that ecosystem. It stays within either the biotic or the abiotic components of the ecosystem. So this is kind of like two boxes, if you will, to help you organize the material that we're going to cover in this lecture as well as the next one. Energy flows through, coming into solar energy, leaving the biological system as heat. Matter cycles within that ecosystem. So one of the ways we classify our different biomes and bringing it down one level to the ecosystem scale is by a measure called primary production. And this is your most direct measure of the amount of photosynthesis occurring within an ecosystem. So primary production is the fixation of energy by autotrophs in an ecosystem. It's basically the conversion of solar energy into the chemical energy of biological molecules. And again, let's expand beyond the equation that we memorize about photosynthesis, because photosynthesis does produce sugars directly, but there are other biosynthetic pathways that spin off of the different byproducts of photosynthesis to produce lipids and proteins as well. Those of you that have taken biochemistry, you learned a lot about that. So primary production is expressed as a rate of primary production. So the grams per meter square per year, that's going to be the units on our measures of primary production. But we know, as what I was just describing in the previous diagram of an ecosystem, that some of the energy that enters into our ecosystem leaves as heat. And we have to take that into account as we look at the transfer of energy from one trophic level up to the next. So one of the measures that we're going to be working with most often is net primary production, or the amount of energy left over after autotrophs meet their own energetic needs, meaning after they have made the ATP from bicellular respiration, and that ATP they need to be in order to survive. So NPP is gross primary production minus the amount of production lost to cellular respiration. So that ends up being the amount of energy available to that first level of consumers, or the herbivores within an ecosystem. Of course, ecosystems and biomes are going to vary in their measures in net primary productivity. And just as we talked about in our lectures on climate, the amount of primary productivity of an ecosystem is determined and also limited by the temperature and moisture levels, or temperature and precipitation characteristic of that ecosystem inside of its biome. So we see very, very high average net primary productivity. Again, the amount of plant material produced per meter square per year. In the tropical rainforest, our own temperate deciduous forests, including those here in Mississippi, are very productive systems. And when you go somewhere with very hot, very dry conditions, such as a desert, you have very low primary productivity. And same thing with tundra, where you go to very cold and relatively dry. Again, very low net primary productivity. So some of the things you're going to read about in the chapter is how primary productivity varies with temperature, precipitation, as well as the nutrient conditions of the soil supporting that ecosystem. And don't make this material hard. It makes sense. The warmer, the more moist, the higher the level of primary productivity. If a system is nutrient limited, very low, very nutrient poor soils, it's going to have lower productivity than an area that has very fertile soils underlying the ecosystem. You know this stuff, in other words. We're putting the terminology to it. So when we look at how primary productivity on the producer level, our bottom of our trophic pyramid here, we see this energy loss, again, from the loss of the energy as the organisms at each level are carrying out cellular respiration. Some of that energy is being held in the body tissues of the organisms. We see this reduction in the amount of energy that is available at each level of the trophic pyramid. And one of the things that most of you were taught in Biology 102 here at MUW is this rule of thumb that only 10% of the energy available at one trophic level is passed on to the next. And this is a good average of all the ecosystems. Tropical rainforest, it's a little bit higher, it's closer to 13. Tundra, it's down closer to 7. But 10 works beautifully as a starting place, and it's the rule of thumb I want you to learn for this course, and in particular as we're studying energy dynamics this week. So again, only 10% of the energy available at one trophic level is passed on to the next. So in other words, Earth's ecosystems are pretty inefficient. Would you buy an automobile that's only 10% efficient and it's burning a gasoline? Nope. Do you want a refrigerator that has an energy efficiency rating of only 10%? Certainly not. But we'll talk in class why it is Earth's ecosystems can be so wasteful. And the answer is pretty obvious. It's right outside the window and it's shining on me right now as I record this. So, thinking about again where this energy is going, where the energy is being lost, if you will, a lot of it goes out the poop chute and enters into the detrital food chain. And that's something that is not depicted in these diagrams of ecosystems, but your book does a wonderful job of discussing the detrital food chain. So look at this with a caterpillar, typical herbivore, eating the plant material. 50% of the biomass intake, as well as the energy it contains, goes right out the poop chute, that is in the form of feces. And again, that becomes food for other organisms in this detrital food chain. Coming back though to our caterpillar, of the other half of the energy that's left, a small portion of it is going into growth and the addition of body tissues for our caterpillar, but the other 2/3 there of what's left over is being released as heat during cellular respiration and the production of the ATP that the caterpillar needs in order for survival. All your cellular processes need energy in the form of ATP for those processes to occur. So it's the old mantra of Dr. Welch's Biology 102 class: when you run out of ATP, you're dead. The last thing I want to leave you with, this chapter does a wonderful job of presenting energy budgets for different types of ecosystems, both terrestrial and aquatic. This is a figure that was in a previous edition of this textbook that the author has chosen not to include in the one we're using now. And I simply want you to look at this and think about how ecologists go about measuring primary productivity, the amount of biomass in an ecosystem. It is an enormous undertaking that is usually accomplished by teams of 20 to 30 people working together. Some of them studying photosynthetic rates, some of them studying the biomass of a tree. Yes, I've been a part of a study where we actually dug up an entire tree. We weighed all of its leaves, all of its small twigs, all of its medium-sized branches. It was unbelievable to be a part of that project. We also looked at some of the detrital food web, and all the nutrient dynamics and matter cycling that goes on, and the transfer of energy that's going on the surface of the ground and, if you will, below the ground. Ecosystems are incredibly complex. They're really, really nifty. I love studying them because when I learned ecosystem ecology, I loved it because it took all the courses I'd taken as a bio major, and suddenly nearly 100% of those courses had application in this single topic. Look forward to discussing this more with you in class this week.